let's talk about this. So for those of you that are just joining us, first we're going to do a summary of all of our findings. So if you didn't know, over the past 2 weeks, we tried everything. We tried, well, not everything. We tried these full stack frameworks. We tried Svelte, Vue, React, Next.js, Remix, and then Next.js. And we're trying to pick one because we're going to build an app with that thing. The thing that we're going to build over it's going to take us a lot of Fridays. We're only going to work on it on Friday, so if you tune in on Friday, you won't miss anything. But we're going to make an app that allows users to create, share, and watch lists of YouTube channels. And I'll talk more about the idea in a second there. Yeah, so so some of our criteria here was that it cannot be in beta or even in release candidate. Like, we're looking for things that are production ready, well tested. We want to work in a somewhat mature ecosystem. So those were really our some of our criteria. Now, when you pick one of these, they all do these kinds of things, and that's why. So if you're thinking like, why isn't X in this list? The reason might be is that it doesn't support this. So all of these frameworks support hybrid rendering, meaning it'll figure out if you need a single page application versus server-side rendering, or a multi-page app, or static site generated. Like, each one of these has their own way of letting you do that, and sometimes figuring it out automatically. Yeah, so Angular would have been Angular Universal. I guess you're right. Angular Universal could have been on the list, but it wasn't. I mean, it took me a week. Well, it took me 5 streams to try each one of them. But they also do a lot of other things: optimized bundling, search engine optimization, file-based routing. They allow you to do like API functions and data loading. All of this stuff, these frameworks allow you to do that, right? Because each one is a framework around some UI framework, right? So Svelte is a UI framework, Vue, React, those are UI frameworks, and then these are meta frameworks on top of them that give you all of this stuff and allow you to use that said front-end framework. Now, these were not the things I was evaluating it on. I was actually evaluating these on the ecosystem because, honestly, especially Remix and SvelteKit, they have really, really cool ideas about how to do all of these things. But they're newer, and Nuxt has been around for a long time, but Nuxt 3 is newer. Next.js is the oldest of all of them. It really is kind of the precursor to all of these, and what a lot of these were inspired by and then also iterated on. But again, we weren't looking at any of this. We were actually looking at the ecosystem itself, because typically when you're working with one of these frameworks, you're not just working with the framework, you're working with a lot of libraries and other stuff. So what we cared about was project setup. How easy is it to get a project up and going? How easy is it to update our configs? How easy is it to add tailwind? How easy is it to get a component library going? How easy is it to get social auth with Google? Which, if you've been watching, it wasn't easy. For whatever reason, a lot of the libraries we're using are very buggy. They need work. Well, and then also, does it support full stack type safety? So here we go. First up, we tried SvelteKit, and real quick, if you want to actually go back and watch the videos where I tried these things, there's a playlist over on YouTube. So this playlist called Choosing a Full Stack Framework. It has me trying each thing. Each one was a different live stream, and they're hours long. So, because it takes a long time to try the thing and debug the thing, and then also answer questions from Twitch chat. So right now I'm kind of summarizing 6 days of streaming. Okay, SvelteKit. In terms of project setup, SvelteKit, really good. We give it 10 out of 10 seedlings. They have a command line tool. It asks you lots of questions like, do you want to use ESLint? Do you want to use Prettier? I like when a CLI tool basically asks you a lot of questions and lets you decide what you want to do, and it does. So I give it a 10 out of 10. For ESLint setup, it gets a low score. I mean, this is partially me. I couldn't figure it out. And let's show you these code examples really quick. So let's look at our Svelte example. And we tried our darndest to get this set up. So the thing is, I prefer to have ESLint set up with the Airbnb config. I don't think Prettier is enough. Prettier handles formatting, but ESLint and especially the Airbnb config handle linting, which is a thing that I care about. And so it came set up with a base ESLint config, but when I was trying to add Airbnb, that's where we ran into issues. Let's take a quick stretch. So it came with ESLint, but I wanted to add Airbnb to it, and we got it working sort of. So if you look at any file that is just a straight TypeScript file, look at this. I remove a semicolon, and it yells at me. It's like, hey, you need a semicolon, and that's what I want. I want my editor to yell at me. But we couldn't get it working in actual Svelte files. So Svelte components have this script section, and you'll notice if I do this, the linter isn't working. Now, I could probably get it working, but I spent like an hour. I didn't get it working, which is why I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. That said, I could probably get it working if I spent more time with it. All right. Next up was Tailwind setup. This is really easy in SvelteKit. There's this svelte add command that comes with SvelteKit that has all kinds of things that you can add, and Tailwind is one of them. So you literally just say svelte add Tailwind, and it automatically configures all of that for you. It essentially generates a Tailwind config, it generates a post-CSS config, a post-CSS file. It just creates all of those files. Done. You don't have to do anything manually. It's really cool. Really cool. So yeah, 10 out of 10. Component library setup. We had a little issues with this because we're using Tailwind, we wanted to find a component library built on top of Tailwind. So we started with Flowbyte, which is cool, really nice. And you can use it standalone as just a Tailwind plugin, but they also have a separate library called Flowbyte Svelte. And this is an actual Svelte component library. So for instance, if you want a button, you can import this component from Flowbyte Svelte, and then it's styled like it would be from Flowbyte. But we couldn't get it working with SvelteKit. So this works with Svelte, but I think there's some issues right now with getting it working in server-side rendering. So we scrapped that, and then we went over to a framework called Skeleton. And so this is built on top of Tailwind, but it's a UI kit for SvelteKit. And we really like this. What did I give this? I gave it a 7 out of 10. The Flowbyte one... 0 out of 10. Like, we couldn't get it working. It was a headache. Skeleton, real nice. I think the reason I gave it a 7 out of 10 is, like, I missed one section in the docs when I was setting it up where, like, I didn't include this, and we were, like, scratching our heads, like, why isn't it working? But once we got it working, it's really cool. They have a bunch of, like, predefined themes that you can choose from. And where do we find the components? Yeah, they have elements. It's pretty cool. Yeah, pretty cool. I haven't looked at carbon components. No, I only tried those two. So we gave it a 7 out of 10. In terms of social auth, you might have heard that Authjs is now a thing, and their announcement of the library was the fact that they had a SvelteKit adapter for Authjs. So Authjs is the next version of next-auth. Next-auth is specifically for Next.js, but Authjs is an initiative to make the library framework agnostic so that it can work with things like SvelteKit or SolidStart. So we tried to use this probably like 2 or 3 days after the announcement that they made it, and we had a really hard time. So I'm giving this a 2 out of 10. Now, we gave it a second chance. What was it, Wednesday of last week? Or Friday? Was it Friday of last week? I don't even remember, but we tried again because obviously using a brand new library, like they even say it in the docs, like it's experimental. You can expect some things to be wrong with it, but we debugged it for hours. We found a GitHub issue. They fixed it, but then it took them like 5 days or so before they merged it. And so the other day, I installed the latest version to get that fix, and overall it was working. But there's still a bug. So like if you look and you've never used next-auth before, it's pretty cool in that you can set it up. So let's say you set up an OAuth provider. This is literally all the code it takes to do that. You just put in this one file, done, good to go. But you can then integrate it with a database. So if you look at their, I guess I want reference. Yeah, I don't know where to look. If you look in their docs, they have database adapters, and specifically they have a Prisma adapter. So this is super nice, right? So you have this one setup, you choose your provider, and then you say, use Prisma as my database, and then in their docs they say, this is the schema that you need, and it handles everything. You literally put this schema in your Prisma schema, and it's supposed to be able to just insert users, create sessions, good to go. Well, actually, when you're integrating with Google, there's an issue where the property that comes back from Google is expires in instead of expires at. Now, of course, you could go in and update the DB schema, but now if you have other OAuth providers that depend on that, it's broken and there's not an easy way to fix it. So 2 out of 10. It'll probably be better, but right now I gave it a 2 out of 10. All right. In terms of full stack type safety, SvelteKit is actually really cool. I give it an 8 out of 10, and it is built in and it does code generation. So, for example, we have this page.server file. So in SvelteKit, it's a little bit awkward. I think it's going to be a little bit awkward to get used to, but it's like every route has a page file, and it could be a server file. If it's a server file, you know that is going to run on the server. It's not client-side code. And then a page.svelte file will be pre-rendered on the server, but you can have client-side code inside of that. Giant CJ. Yeah. I mean, was that weird? Was that a weird transition? That was my first time trying it. I think it worked. But for example, I have this page.server file, and it ties together with the page.svelte file. So right now, it's my only route. You could create subfolders and subroutes, and basically, when those 2 files are next together, they work together. So this is basically the backend code for the landing page. And I have a function defined here called load that returns an object that has an items property with a bunch of items. It was neat. Cool. So I defined my stuff here. Notice I didn't have to define an interface. I just defined the thing. And then inside of our actual component file, I can import this page data type, which is generated. It's generated types. But now if I look at my data property, it has all of those types ready to go. So the only type that I have to import in any of my components is page data, and then the types flow through. So I don't have to import a separate type or a separate interface. I mean, you could. Obviously, there's going to be use cases where you might want to do that, but it is really nice that you don't have to, right? The types just flow through. You define your backend route. Basically, this is like your the code that will run on the server before the page gets rendered, right? And you can do that stuff here. This returns an object. The types flow through, and then you can use those types in here. So data is typed, and then we're doing, like, when we're doing an iteration, everything is typed. It's beautiful. And Chris Nova, welcome in. Thank you for the raid. So yeah, 8 out of 10. All right. In summary, it seems SvelteKit... it seems fine, right? Like the main issues we had were linting and finding an auth library that is working and production ready, right? Everything else about SvelteKit seems pretty great. And I talked about it earlier, but we haven't even got into like how it does these things differently than the other frameworks. But I kind of like the way that it does some of these things, right? So, okay, that's SvelteKit. Let's move on to Nuxt. So if you're not familiar with Nuxt, Nuxt is the full stack framework for Vue.js. And they're in a bit of a transition period because Nuxt version 2 was out for a long time, and it actually took a while before they got Nuxt version 3, which is compatible with Vue 3. So if you go to next.js.org, this is the documentation for Nuxt 2. If you go to nuxt.com, this is the documentation for Nuxt 3. Let's take a quick stretch, and we'll answer this question from Cyberdelic Shroom, who says, what is linting? What is linting? Think of it like a spell checker for your code. And the reason I like it, especially like on a team project, is I can set up my linting configuration that says, we require semicolons. All strings should be single quotes instead of double quotes. Anytime you have an anonymous function, it should be an arrow function. These are all things that I can put into my linting config, and then my editor will yell at me if I'm not doing that thing. So for example, right now, look in this code. If I get rid of this, well, you saw that, but if I get rid of this semicolon, I literally get a red squiggly that says, hey, you should put a semicolon. Now, of course, if you know anything about JavaScript or TypeScript, it'll technically work without semicolons. And the Shibas, thank you for that. Sanjay developer, awesome. So the code will still work. Like basically, linting is things that are mostly opinion based. A lot of times there are good reasons to have the opinion of like you should use semicolons. I'm not going to get into that debate though, but that's what a linter is. It basically makes sure that all of our code is consistent, and especially if we're working on a team of developers where there might be slight inconsistencies between developers. The linter is going to make sure that everyone commits code that looks similar. And then when we're doing code reviews, we don't have to worry about code style. We know everyone is adhering to that linting config, and we can care about the stuff that's important, like does the code work, or is the code work written in an efficient way, that kind of thing. Yeah, and like Pathogen is saying, like there are linter rules that actually do make a lot of sense. Like technically the code still works, but linter rules will still catch things that might result in bugs. But yeah, okay, let's talk about Nuxt. I saw a comment earlier when I was like, well, we've got nuxt.com versus next.js. It is confusing. I think eventually everything will be migrated to Nuxt, but the issue is because Nuxt 2 has been around for so long, people still need the old documentation. There are still people working in, like, I mean, it's weird to even call it a legacy app. It's not a legacy app. It's just, it's not version 3, which is a complete rewrite. So this is it. And it's built on top of Vue.js. So if you've watched Coding Garden in the past, Vue.js is really one of my favorite front-end frameworks. It's really nice. It really jives with how I think about front-end code and data binding. And honestly, like data binding for a lot of people is a dirty word, but it doesn't really even do data binding. It works the same way as React. There's a single unidirectional data flow. It doesn't matter. Vue is cool. I like Vue a lot. And so Nuxt basically is a wrapper around Vue that adds all of these full stack features. So talked about this earlier, but these full stack frameworks do a lot of things, and this is what Nuxt is doing written on top of the Vue framework itself. So in terms of project setup, I give this a 5 out of 10. So whenever you generate a Nuxt project, it is bare. It literally, there's like 4 files, and you have one app.vue file, which is your entry point. And everything else you have to create yourself. So I created the layouts folder, the pages folder. Like, it does expect these folders to exist, like with a specific name, and you have to read the docs for that. So if you go to the docs and you go through getting started and you look at the guide, this actually shows you what a full directory structure would look like. Look at me, I can point. You can see what and then in the docs here, you can actually click on any one of these folders, like let's say pages, and it's going to tell you what that folder is for, what you should put in there, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of possible folders, but when it generates the app, there are no folders at all. So that's why I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. And it's like you could hold people's hand a little bit more. So yeah. So 5 out of 10. And then in terms of linting setup, really this is because of the Vue ecosystem. So literally in the Vue GitHub organization. So all of the Vue projects are under Vue.js. So like the core library, everything else. Nuxt isn't technically from the core team, but all the other Vue stuff is. But if you look in the Vue GitHub organization, they have a bunch of examples on how to set up the ESLint config Airbnb with all different kinds of Vue apps. So the reason it was so easy to set up ESLint Airbnb config was because the Vue ecosystem has all of the example configs that we could pull from. When are we exploring Redwood? Eventually, so the thing is, Redwood does not do this single-page application versus server-side rendering versus multi-page applications versus static site generating, as far as I know. I could be wrong on that, but when I was reading the documentation, Redwood basically gives you a GraphQL API with a React front end, which would just be a single-page application. So Redwood doesn't do this extra stuff, as far as I know. And that's why it's not included in this list. Yeah, and I think this is a good point about like having the setup that gets generated with nothing, and we kind of talked about that. Like basically, by generating the app with only an app.vue, you have to go to the documentation. You have to go to the docs. You have to read about, okay, what folders do I need? What are those folders for? So it is a good learning mechanism. But I think if you already know what all of those folders are for, you probably want a more fleshed out setup. So it depends, right? It depends. But I could see that standpoint, yeah. I guess that's true, TJMR, and I didn't even talk about that because with Nuxt, they have a CLI. It's called Nuxie. And then Nuxie has commands for adding different things. I didn't actually use the CLI, though. and I didn't use those commands. API. Here we go. So there's this nuxt add command, and then you can add components, composable, layout, plugin, page. So if you run this from the command line, it's going to actually generate those for you. That is a good point. I actually didn't even get to explore their CLI. But that is what, I mean, maybe they could get a little bit better than a 5 out of 10, because if you're actually using the CLI, it can do a lot. Is Such a Bear starting app good or bad for learning? I would argue it's good for learning, but it's cumbersome for someone who just wants to get up and go and maybe already knows a few things. But if you're learning, it's great because it forces you to go over to the guide, to read about each folder, like what each one is for. So yeah. Yeah, so basically it's called Airbnb because the engineers at Airbnb were the ones that created it. Yeah, it has nothing to do with, I mean, the linting file itself has nothing to do with rental properties or whatever. We did talk about this as well because for auth we use Sidebase nuxt-auth, and if you look at I'll talk about that in a second. Thank you for bringing that up, but I'll show you Sidebase because the thing is they're not the core library, they're third party, but they do have like a more fleshed out setup. Project setup, I'll upgrade it to like 7 out of 10 because honestly, if you use the CLI, yeah, okay. Tailwind setup, 10 out of 10. If you look on the Nuxt website, they have this module section, and anyone can publish a module that can integrate with Nuxt and the CLI. So if you search for Tailwind in here, it's there. If you search for auth, you'll see the one that we used. There's a bunch of things, and people can publish them, and then they can be easily added to a Nuxt app. So we just used this Tailwind one, and we instantly had Tailwind up and going. It generated the config file for us. We went in and configured it for Daisy UI, which is the component library. We gave it a 10 out of 10. So if you watch me talk about SvelteKit, we tried Flowbyte with SvelteKit. We scrapped that. Then we used Skeleton, which is specific to SvelteKit. That worked. And then from here on out, every other framework we tried, we just used Daisy UI. So Daisy UI is a component library written on top of Tailwind. And the reason we chose it is because they have all these cool themes. Not the reason. One of the reasons is they also have this theme called Forest. And then it looks like Coding Garden Green. Look at that. They got a nice green logo here. If you look at the buttons, you got nice green buttons. But they have a lot of themes you can choose from. Daisy UI is pretty slick. But that's what we use. We set it up. Easy. Okay, social auth. Give it a 4 out of 10. So this is the Sidebase thing that somebody brought up earlier. So again, if you go to modules over here on the Nuxt website, you search for auth, you're going to find next-auth. This is not from the core team. This is from a team called Sidebase. And what they have done is written a library that wraps next-auth. Now, this may sound familiar, right? Because Authjs is a new thing that is making next-auth framework agnostic. Sidebase did this first, and so if you look at their library, basically it's written on top of next-auth, but wrapped and reworked so that it can work with Nuxt. I think eventually the Authjs team is going to release a plugin for Nuxt, and so this probably won't need to exist anymore. This one here probably won't need to exist anymore when they release it, but they haven't released it yet, and so right now this is kind of all we got. So we did that. Why does it seem like Nuxt is a Next copycat? I mean, because it is. They all of these copied from each other or learned from each other, right? So Next.js was the first of its kind, but Remix, Nuxt, SvelteKit, they're all doing similar things that were all inspired by Next, and they're doing things differently because some of the things that that Next does isn't the best and could be iterated on. So that's why other ones pop up and challenge the status quo. That's what they do. Okay, so there's this library, and if you look at the Sidebase website, they actually have quite a few modules and plugins for the Nuxt ecosystem. So if you look at Sidebase, they have next-auth, Nuxt Session, Nuxt Prisma, and they actually have a CLI tool to generate a Nuxt app that's a little more full-featured than just the plain old app that you get with the Nuxie CLI. So they technically have another CLI tool you could use. We didn't try that, though. We just used the one from Nuxt itself. And then they're the creators of next-auth. Okay, so the reason I'm giving it a 4 out of 10 is because... How do I talk about this? It's like, It is nice that I was able to share my my Prisma config with the SvelteKit app that I had already worked on. You can see this is our setup here. Does this give us a TypeScript error? Yeah, so this is weird that there's like a TypeScript error that needs to be fixed. I think the main issue is when we were using it, nuxt-auth was dependent on a specific version of next-auth. And when we installed it, we had a newer version, and so that broke some things. Eventually, once we figured out that we needed to lock the version of next-auth, we got it working. But I don't like that because it's an old version of next-auth. So if you look at... so I'll talk about that in a second. Thank you, 4K got it official. So there are a few options when it comes to auth in the Nuxt ecosystem, and I'll definitely talk about that. But for next-auth, which uses next-auth, you have to lock the dependency. So if you look at next-auth, current version is 4.18.7. Nuxt-auth, which is the one that wraps this, is locked to version 4.18.0. And as long as you have that version installed, everything will work. But the reason I probably wouldn't reach for this library is like with an auth library, you want the latest updates, right? You want to be able to have the latest bug fixes, sometimes like security fixes. You want that. So until nuxt-auth can work with the latest version of next-auth, that's a pretty big issue, which is why I'm giving it a 4 out of 10. Now they're probably working on it. Yeah, so 4.18.1 had the breaking changes. They haven't fixed it yet. They're working on it, but when we tried it, it didn't work unless we locked the version, and I didn't really want to lock the version. Okay, but let's talk about other options for auth in the Nuxt ecosystem because it is a bit fragmented. So, okay, you look at this module, and you're like, oh, this seems great. This seems great. Awesome. This is for Nuxt 2. Remember we talked about earlier that Nuxt 2 is not Nuxt 3? This is for Nuxt 2. And the thing is, we looked at their docs and we couldn't find anything that said it didn't work with Nuxt 3. So like, all right, let's do it. We're installing things. We're going. And then at one point it was like, you must use Vuex. But if you know about the Vue ecosystem, you know in Vue 3 we use Pinia, not Vuex. So you're like, oh no, that's not going to work. So what we did find though is there's a community fork of this to work with Nuxt 3. If somebody wants to link me to it, or I can't remember what it was. So like probably like nuxt-3-auth or something like that. All of that to say, somebody wrote a fork of this that works with Nuxt 3 and the Pinia store. We didn't use it because at the same time, the Nuxt core team is also working on a new version that will work with Nuxt 3. Basically, it's a hot mess. It's a big old hot mess. And the other thing is, like, I wanted to try using Sidebase auth, this one, because it was based on next-auth, we could use the exact same database schema that we used with SvelteKit and Authjs core, or Authjs, which is why we opted to use this one. I'm sorry I couldn't find it, but basically it's a fork of this that works with version 3. We didn't even try that. If we would have tried that, it probably would have worked, but the tricky part about it is it's just a basic fork. They don't have updated documentation, so you would be using that, referencing this documentation, and then also have to cross-reference to make sure you're doing the Nuxt 3 things, not the Nuxt 2 things. We didn't really want to do that, so that's why we didn't use that library. All right, where were we? We're talking about full stack type safety in Nuxt. So, what does that mean? Actually, this is the coolest thing about Nuxt. And actually, I haven't even talked about like what Nuxt can do. But when you're working in a Nuxt app, they actually have a bunch of automatic imports. But, check this out. So I'm in this file. This is called users.ts, and it's inside of the server folder and then the API folder. So this, if you're comparing this to like Next.js, this is kind of like a serverless function, or could end up being a serverless function in the API folder. But check it out. So I have define event handler. It finds users in my database and then returns them. But if you're a keen JavaScript developer, you'll notice that I did not import define event handler. In Nuxt, there are a bunch of things that are just automatically imported for you and globally available. It's magic. Some of you might hate that. You might just be like, no, I do not like that. Yeah, that's nasty. That's too much magic. But the thing is, like, the more I look at like larger code bases in like Next.js or even like Remix and even like SvelteKit, it just gets really boilerplatey and really messy. So I think it could grow on you. I think it can grow on you. Why would anyone hate auto import? Because of the magic. Like, until you get used to it, you have no idea, potentially no idea what's available to you, unless you like read the documentation. So, yeah. In the interest, yeah, it's funny that all the chat messages were like, ew, some people like this, you know? So that's one interesting thing, is that these are like globally available. And then also, like, if you look inside the view components, for instance, things like use fetch is globally available. There's also define page meta, that's globally available. You'll notice I'm getting type completion because all of this is like TypeScript generated types, and like basically it says that those types are available globally. So like you still get editor support, which is pretty cool. But they all get imported. All right, so let's talk about full stack type safety though. So I have this API route. It queries my database for all of the users and then returns them like so. Now, obviously, in the real world, you wouldn't make all of the users in your database available to anybody via the API. This is just an example because it's the only data we had access to. But it's doing the thing. And you'll notice that this is an array of type user. It's fully typed because of the Prisma client, and that type is there. Now, inside of the component, if I need to call that route, it's like magic. It's magic. So if I do use fetch, look at this. If you're used to TRPC, you're like, oh yeah, I get that. But look at that. All of my API routes, type completion. It literally tells me all of the routes that I could potentially make a request against, which is pretty sweet. And then once I do that, the types flow through as well. So if I look at data, it's a ref, which is a way how we deal with data that's potentially changing in Vue. But it's a ref that has users on it, and users is of type user. So you'll notice I didn't have to import the types. I didn't have to define interfaces, and it's kind of like the best of TRPC, like embedded in the framework. You know, it's pretty cool. And the added benefit here, or the added bonus, is this page can be server rendered. So data is potentially undefined, value is potentially undefined. So that's why we have the question marks there. Yeah, I mean, I can get rid of that. Wait, there's more. So actually, I'm going to spin this up really quick. Do I have the dependencies? Because I want to show you the magic. The magic. Okay. So you'll notice right here, this is where I'm listing out the users on the page. The app is ugly. Disregard that. Right here is where I'm listing out the users that came from the API. And those are server-side rendered, right? So the initial page load is server-side rendered. If I curl this web page, the HTML that I get back is going to have that data hydrated inside of it. And you'll see a list item that has my name in it. Right here. Well, that's the data. Yeah, I guess technically, like, it hydrates the initial page load, and then like injects that data, right? So the initial page load actually does not have any XML HTTP requests. There's no API requests being made. The initial page load is server-side rendered. But watch this. If I go to the About page, and then I come back to the home page, we see an XML HTTP request. So Nuxt is able to take this little bit of code right here and know that when it's server-side rendered, basically have direct access to this function over here during the server-side render. So like, this isn't an HTTP request to itself when it's being server-side rendered. It literally is in the same JavaScript context to invoke this function, get the data back, and then inject it. But then when it noticed that I'm navigating via single page application, then it turns that into an actual HTTP request. Yeah, it's not XML. I mean, it says XHR in my tab. That's what XHR stands for. But yeah, I'm getting JSON data. It's an HTTP request. Can you force it to always do an SSR? Yeah, I think so. So like right now, the way that I have the link, you can look at my nav, which is in my layout. I have a Nuxt link. There's probably a way of doing a link that will always trigger a full re-render. Yeah. But the beautiful thing about that, right, is like in the past that would have taken a lot of code to like differentiate the backend request versus the front end request. Like doing this same thing in Next.js requires a bunch of duplicate code. So this is really nice. And you'll see like I'm literally getting JSON data here, and like the framework is kicked in, is like loading it into the page. So it's awesome. I will mention SvelteKit does a very similar thing, but I do prefer, like, to me, I like the magic. I like the way this is done here versus how it's done in SvelteKit. But regardless. Okay, so I give it a 10 out of 10. It's really nice. In summary, Nuxt is really cool. Like I like Vue.js. I like Nuxt has all of this magic. Like Nuxt is definitely the most magic of all of the ones that we tried, and I like that about it. That said, it's very new. It's very new, right? So like it took a really long time to go from V2, which is this one, to now version 3, which means the ecosystem has not had time to catch up. So like the auth module that we wanted to use it's kind of working, but there are some issues. That's probably the main hang up I have with Nuxt, is that it's so new, the ecosystem is so young. We're going to have some issues trying to find other libraries, because a component library and an auth library aren't the only things we're going to need. We're going to need other stuff. And it's possible that it doesn't exist yet. So that's really my main concern with choosing Nuxt, is like it's so new, the ecosystem is young. Yeah. Got released 2 months ago. So, yeah. Okay, Remix. Remix is cool. If you go to remix.run, you can learn about it. If you just scroll their page, like this is a beautifully designed marketing website that tells you like all the stuff that it does. This is probably one of the coolest things it has going for it, is this idea of nested routing. So you'll notice that like you have the main page, then you have like master detail views, like the detail view, and then within the detail view, you even have like a sub page. It's really good at doing like nested routes like that. It loads fast, and honestly, their documentation is one of the things that stands out the most about Remix. The documentation is really well done, really well done. But project generation, 11 out of 10. Like, so if you go through the Remix docs and you look at the blog tutorial, it walks you through generating the app, and they actually have several templates available to you. Here we go, the stacks. They have pre-configured templates for all of the things that you might want to do. Like, you really would call, like, Remix is the like production ready framework. Like they have everything that you might need. And so they have several different stacks that you can choose from: the blue stack, the indie stack, the grunge stack. We chose the indie stack, and we're kind of just blown away about what we got out of the box. Like it did generate a lot of code and a lot of auth code, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's really nice that it just all comes out of the box. It kind of was a breath of fresh air, because none of these other frameworks did that. So 11 out of 10. Setting up the ESLint Airbnb config was fairly simple. We had a hiccup because we tried to use the Airbnb config specifically for React, but we didn't need to do that because Remix already comes with an ESLint config. But let's look at that example. 11 out of 10. Yeah, just because like I think it was above and beyond any of the other project generation things that we did. But you'll see it gives you a lot. So this is the generated app that we got. And it actually did come with an ESLint file. We just modified it to add Airbnb in here. Someone remind me after we talk about Remix. I'll talk about. Actually, we're already here. I'll talk about Airbnb. People keep asking, what is Airbnb? It's the Airbnb style guide. So Airbnb is a company that employs software engineers. Some of those software engineers write JavaScript, and they all came together and wrote a style guide. So if you look up the Airbnb JavaScript style guide, it is basically a bunch of guidelines for writing JavaScript code. And then this has been converted into an ESLint config. So if you look at this repo here, for example, arrow functions, they say when you have an anonymous function passed into like a map or a filter, you should use an arrow function. Don't use the function keyword. That is their opinion. And it's really just an opinion, because for the most part, this code would work the same way. Where this code differs is how like the this binding works. But regardless, they say write your code like this, and then this has been turned into an ESLint config, and so if you write code like this, you're going to get a little red squiggly that says, hey, you should write it like that. And they have opinions about a lot of stuff. So if you look at their style guide, you can read about all their opinions. And I've been using their style guide for like 7 years at this point, at least. And so I'm just really used to it, which is why I try to set it up in every app I go into, every JavaScript app that I go into. Okay. Tailwind setup. It was already set up, 10 out of 10. So when we generated the app, it came with Tailwind. We've got a Tailwind config. It's just ready to go. Component library setup. This was also super easy because we chose Daisy. We talked about that a little bit ago. But I think we were like, we know it's going to work. Why even go through the trouble of adding it? Because I don't think I even have the Daisy plugin in here. But yeah, that was fine. And then social auth. 7 out of 10. So in the Remix ecosystem, there's a library called remix-auth and remix-auth Google. And I actually got it all set up in under 30 minutes. So like it doesn't come by default with this generated app. Let's talk about this for a second. So the generated app actually comes with its own auth code. So you can look in session to see how they set up the session storage, which is cookie storage. But one of the things I don't like is there's a lot of code in here. Now, that said, like if you start your app from here and you need to go in and change how some of these functions work, you have complete access to it, right? Like this is your TypeScript file at this point. You can change it, you can update, you can modify it. But this is also a lot of code in the code base to maintain. And I really like it when an auth library hides all of this stuff from me. Because then I don't have to maintain that code. So that's one gripe that I did have is like if you're going to be implementing user auth with like username and password, they give you the code pre-generated, but it is a lot of code. So you have like the session code. Let's look. What else do we have? Yeah, there's like the login page. It's doing a bunch of like obviously you would take this and like do it your preferred way and maybe even like add in some best practices. Like this login function is manually validating emails and passwords. Like you probably would pull in a validation library for this. You probably would try to have some sort of like standardized, centralized error handling. Because right now we're doing a 400 status code like within this. Like there is, all I'm saying is there's a better way to write this, but you do have to maintain that code. So that is one thing. Now, all of this login system that it generates is for username and password login. We wanted social auth, which is like OAuth, being able to log in with an OAuth provider. And so we just set that up in a separate app because we didn't want to mess with all of this generated code. So we actually have this Google Auth example using the remix-auth library. Let me double check that's the name of them, though. So we have remix auth and remix-auth socials are actually what we had. So I had that wrong in the slides. It's not remix-auth Google, it's remix-auth socials. But these are community packages, but they work really well. And to add them in requires a few things. So let's see. We have our auth settings that define our user type. We have our session setup, very similar to how we were doing username password, but now this auth library will automatically handle those sessions for us. And then we have the auth callback, which is part of the OAuth flow. And then we have the actual auth login. So the reason I'm giving this a 7 out of 10 is because, again, it's still a lot more code. It's like, I mean, it's not that much code, but it is significantly more than like next-auth. So if you've ever configured next-auth, it's literally one file, handles everything else. I feel like remix-auth probably could do that, but it's really probably a matter of opinion of like, do you actually want to hide that from the user? And then once you hide that, you need to make things available via the API. And we ran into this like last time we were working with next-auth. In certain scenarios, like the API they've provided is somewhat rigid in that like we want to do something that it isn't making available to us. So if we want to do that, we have to like override internal functions and stuff. Those are the trade-offs between like by having it separated out like this, it's probably slightly more customizable than like next-auth, but it is a lot more that needs to be set up. So I gave it a 7 out of 10. It worked really well once we got it set up. I set this up in under 30 minutes. We generated the Remix app, got the OAuth flow going in under 30 minutes. It was pretty nice. And then full stack type safety, 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10. Yeah, it is React. So Remix is built on top of React, and it's basically a full stack framework that uses React internally. So why do I give their full stack type safety a 7 out of 10? It's just a little more manual. So like you saw, so far we looked at SvelteKit, we looked at Nuxt. Both of those, like the types just flow through. Like there's not a lot of manual code to just get the types going. Here, everything is very explicit. And now, like that's typically how it is when you're working in a React code base. Like there's not much magic. There aren't many things hidden from you, but that results in more code. And so for this example, like get post is going to get all the posts from the database, and we have this loader which we specify right next to our component that's actually going to render it out. And then we have this use loader data, which is provided by Remix, that basically allows us to use that, and then the types will flow through from here. But if you compare this to like how Nuxt works or even how SvelteKit works, it is a bit more manual. Yeah, and I think like Dances with Dirt is saying like I don't like surprises. It's really a matter of opinion, right? The thing that I think about is when you have a code base with like at this point there's only 2 sections of the code base, right? You have notes and you have posts. What happens when there's 10, when there's 15, and you're really used to working in this code? Now it's just a bunch of boilerplate. Like every single thing you have to set up has that same code. And honestly, like this isn't a dig on Remix. This is just a dig on how things are in React. Like things are just very manual. Yeah. And like that's also what I'm thinking about. Like as the code base grows, eventually the people working in that code base don't want to have to do the same things over and over and over again, which is where some of that magic comes in. So there's this, and I think if we look at get post, this is in models, and then you could think of the models folder. So they generate this folder for you. You could call it whatever you want because again, it's just TypeScript. You just import the things you need. But I think of this as our DAL, our data access layer. So these are essentially data access layer for all of our entities, and this function has, for instance, get post. Now right now, there's no database. It's just like fake data. But you could imagine there would be like a Prisma query in here to actually get that data back. And then this is what's being used in the actual page as a hook here. Now, I do believe that this gives us that magic of initial page load, server-side rendered. If it's a single-page application load, it knows to make an HTTP request. So that's nice too. But again, it's just more code to get it done. All right, in summary, Remix looks really good. Like, it's really production ready. The only gripes I have about it are not even anything to do with Remix. It's the fact that it's like React, and things are just more manual in React. So yeah, Remix. If you like React, you're probably going to like Remix a whole lot more than Next.js, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Next.js. Now I'm going to go through this really quick because Next.js has been around for a long time, and the things we're evaluating it on, it does because it has a pretty mature ecosystem. So project setup, actually, I give it a 6 out of 10 because it doesn't give you a lot, and it doesn't ask you any questions. It literally just poops out a Next.js template. But it doesn't ask you, do you want linting? Do you want tailwind? It doesn't ask you any of that. It just gives you a basic template. Now, if you look through the ecosystem, people have created templates. For example, Create T3 app is a more full-fledged project generator for a Next app. But if you look at the one from the core team, it's pretty basic, which is why I gave it a 6 out of 10. And then setting up ESLint Airbnb config was the exact same as Remix. I give it a 10 out of 10. Tailwind, easy. You literally just, in the docs, they tell you how to do it. Easy. Again, component library was easy. We just used Daisy UI at that point. And then social auth was easy because things just worked. So specifically for Next.js, we use next-auth. Next-auth still exists. So we've been talking about Authjs. This is the one that they are basically... Actually, does this work with Next.js? We didn't even use this one. We still use next-auth. We didn't try using Authjs with the next module. But eventually, this is going to be where this moves from. So next-auth is going to be completely migrated where people will use this instead. But we just used next-auth. It just worked. Like, I mean, if you watched the episode, it was just like, yeah, no surprises. Like, Next is really, really mature framework. And in terms of built-in full-stack type safety, I think this is the one thing that's completely lacking, and I gave it a 2 out of 10. And let me show you what I'm talking about. Now, of course, you may be saying, well, just use TRPC. Yeah, of course. Like, if you add TRPC, I mean, if you're evaluating TRPC itself, like, that's amazing full-stack type safety. But without Next.js, without that, it's pretty cumbersome. So let me show you what I did. And what I mean by, like, lots of duplicate code. Okay, so in Next.js, there's this concept of the API folder, and these will be your API routes. So for instance, if I had a route that needed to get all the users from the database, that would look like this. So I have this handler that, in this case, we actually did hook it up to auth because we had I mean, honestly, this is another point about not having to worry about configuration and things actually working, because it was so easy to set up the app, add all the things we needed, even add next-auth, that we were like, we might as well actually do some authorization. So we actually wrote the code that will send back an unauthorized message if you're not logged in to be able to get back these users. And in the docs, like, for whatever reason, you have to use this. There might be some Next experts in the chat. They're like, you don't have to do that, but from what I could find, this is what you need to do. Like, you need to get the session of the current user that just made the API request. Then you have access to the user to see if they're actually logged in, and then you can do the business. So this was a little bit cumbersome, but the issue is this is just an API route. So my app/API/users will return this JSON data or an unauthorized message. If I want to load this same data on a page, I just have to write the same code. And if you look in the next docs, they tell you that. So if we look, for example, at our homepage, we have this get server-side props. So this is the Next.js way of getting data before server-side rendering. And we had to do the same thing. So we had to get the session, but it's like slightly different. And then we had to query the user. So I think you can have middlewares. You can. And we could probably try to figure out a way to share code more easily. But at that point, it's really just like an architecture decision. Like, it's something else we need to figure out. I don't know. From what I could see, you basically have to duplicate the code. There is no way for you to call your API route and get server-side props. If you look in the Next.js documentation, they tell you need to just refactor that code into a reusable function and then call that same function in both places. In our case, like, we probably could have done a slight refactor, but we still would need to pass in all of these things separately, or like they are different depending on where the request is coming from. So built into Next.js, it's really cumbersome. It's really cumbersome. And then I actually don't know how this would handle single page application routing. Like, if you went to another page and then you came back, would it actually be able to turn this into an HTTP request? Maybe. But regardless, it's very lacking. Like I said, you could use something like TRPC. You're going to have a much better time because it's just built in. But again, that's a separate library. All right, so in summary, Next.js, super mature ecosystem. Everything is just it's even more manual than like in Remix, for instance. So it's only server-side rendered? Okay. So that's my summation of everything. It's a mature ecosystem. Everything mostly works, but it's React, and so everything is still just like really manual. All right. In conclusion, what am I going to choose? And so to give you some background on this, for those of you that are new here, today we're starting our Friday project. So our last Friday project was an app called Fresh Spots, which is an app that allowed users to create and share lists of places to visit. So you could create like list of 10 best restaurants in my city and then like share that list, but it showed it on a map. That was the last app we built. This app we're going to build today, or not today, over the next like few months. I can't scroll because you all are chatting. Is an app that will allow users to create, share, and watch lists of YouTube channels. So the idea is, as a user, I can go in, I can, for instance, create a list of all my favorite cooking channels. So I like to watch the Babbage Culinary Universe, You Suck at Cooking, Maddie Matheson, Munchies, Bon Appetit, The Internet Shaquille, there's quite a few like cooking channels that I like to watch, but right now on YouTube, all of those videos are just intermixed with all of the other channels that I'm subscribed to. So I want to be able to literally create a list of the channels that I want to see, and then this will create a feed of videos from those creators. And then you can take that feed and just share it with anyone else. So you could create, like, I also like to watch skateboarding videos. So there's Thrasher and there's Ride and there's like Nike skateboarding and there's a bunch of skateboarding channels. But it'd be nice to just, if I'm in the mood to watch skateboarding, put that list on. So that this is the app that we're going to build, and this is the reason why we're looking into all of these frameworks, because we're going to pick one of those frameworks to build this app. Yeah, I'm really building up the suspense. Like, what did I choose? What did I choose? And I'll be honest, the decision is multifaceted, right? Because it goes to an ad break. It's not just like what's the best one? Like, obviously it has to deal with the ecosystem, and it also is like forward looking, right? So like some of the bugs and things that we ran into are going to be fixed eventually. It's just going to take a little bit of time. So that's factored in as well. So in terms of longevity, so an app that's at least going to be around for like the next 4 or 5 months, what is something we could use that is going to have longevity? And please don't disappoint. Actually, I before I show you my result, I actually want to see how the chat is feeling. Well, what do you think I should have chosen? You have a minute to vote. What, based on my findings, based on everything I just showed you, what would you have chosen? Did I say multifaceted? No, I'm absolutely going to disappoint someone in the chat. Yeah, look at all these Nuxt fans. It's interesting. See, like, Nuxt is kind of amazing, right? There's so much magic. So much magic, and that's nice. That's nice. Let's take a quick stretch, and then I'll reveal what I'm going to use. Now, at this point, like, making this poll, like, you watched me do it, but you didn't go through all of these frameworks. So like, I was going to say like post-traumatic stress. I don't even know if that makes sense. I have the experience of trying all of these, so that's where my decision is coming from as well. I know a lot of people are just voting for Next because they like React. So here's the thing. Okay, let's keep an eye on this. So right now it says there are 494 people watching. The moment I make my decision, 100 people are just going to leave. But I encourage you to stick around. Because it's going to be a good time, and especially like learning something new, right? Like, I choose a thing that you didn't want me to choose, but you can still learn a little bit about it. All right, what did I choose? SvelteKit. SvelteKit is the answer. Now again, let me reiterate let me reiterate why. So we did have issues with the auth library, right? So like Authjs, we had some major issues with this. Major issues with Authjs. But there are other options. 80% of viewers disappointed. But let me just convince you of SvelteKit really quick. So first of all, like, we didn't even talk about the front end framework itself, right? So like, you've got React, you've got Vue, you've got Svelte. How to unsub? You can go to your account settings, and then there's like a subscription section, and then you can just choose not to renew. But and so here's the other thing to think about from my perspective as well, right? Like, I am a content creator, right? Like, people watch me to see my opinions on things, and also to like they watch me to see me try this so that they don't have to try it. And also, like, SvelteKit is very popular right now. That's another thing that factored into my decision. But even though it is cutting edge, it's production ready, and it comes from a really solid team, right? Like, Rich Harris knows what he's doing. He's a really smart dude, knows what he's doing, and they've taken lessons learned from Next.js, from various other frameworks, and they're doing it right. Now, you could argue that some of the things are a little bit clunky, but I think it's only going to get better. And Zolo, thank you for the resub. Never used it, but always wanted to learn. Nice, thank you. So that's the thing. And then the other thing is, like, in terms of yeah, you might be right, Crom. Like, is SvelteKit too new? because one of the first hurdles we're going to have to get over is implementing auth, because we tried it with Authjs and it was a little bit broken. We have other options though. There is this thing called Lucia, which we could get working. We also could just do it ourselves, which is, we've done that before. It's not the end of the world. So yeah. Viewers went up. Okay, so people didn't leave. I said 100 people were going to leave the moment I told you what my decision was. So I chose SvelteKit, and there's a... I think if I go back in the slides, like early on in the slides, I talked about... These are the things that I wasn't evaluating all of them on. But if you do, SvelteKit, I think, comes out on top for a lot of these things. It's probably like on par with Remix, with like a little bit more magic sprinkled in. So yeah, people heard SvelteKit and grab their pitchfork. Yeah, because like the other cool. So let's just talk about SvelteKit for a second. Let me justify my decision. So, coding.garden is a very basic website, but this was actually built with SvelteKit. And one of the nice things is this is a completely static website. This is not running a Node.js instance. I built the app with SvelteKit, and then I used their adapter called adapter static. And it literally took my SvelteKit app and turned it only into a single page application. Like, there is no server-side process for this because it's a very, very simple app. Of course, I'm biased. I mean, and this is just like one little experience I had with SvelteKit. And honestly, I didn't do, like, somebody made a pull request to my repo that converted the whole thing to SvelteKit, and then I had to go in and change a few things. But yeah, I'll show you how I did my slides in just a second. So SvelteKit has some really cool things. Like, you can see there's an adapter for Cloudflare, Netlify, Versal, and then there's also adapter static, which if you've written your code in the right way, you can literally just generate static files and host on a CDN. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is another thing to bring up. Like, there are less jobs in Svelte, so there's no point in learning it as a beginner. I disagree. Like, there are more and more companies that are choosing Svelte over something like React. Like, React obviously is the safe choice, but Svelte does some really cool things, and companies are choosing it. It's happening. I wanted to look at the like the state of JS survey from last year, because they had some stats on like what people were using. So if we look at libraries, yeah, like last year SvelteKit wasn't really even on this list, but Svelte itself was listed here. And if you look at like usage, 20% of respondents were using Svelte last year. I have a feeling the results for 2022 are going to come out pretty soon. I have a feeling it's probably going to be like at least 10% more. There's a lot more people using Svelte these days. I do agree with that, Pablo. Like, I'm kind of like placing my bets on SvelteKit, right? Like, I think this will be the year of Svelte. Well, I just jump into coding or do modeling the app. So that's what we're going to do today. Basically. So I made my choice. I'm sorry if I disappointed you. I'll build something with each one of those things eventually. But for now, the Friday project is going to use SvelteKit. And I'm not opposed to doing like a quick 4-hour stream where I build a single app with Remix, or I build a single app with Nuxt. Something that's not super complicated. The app that we're going to be building is fairly complicated, and it's going to take us a while to do it. So we're going to be using SvelteKit for it. But like I said, there'll be one-off streams where I try these other things every now and then. Yeah, and I don't even think this is a hot take, Jonah Codes. It's just like the same thing is happening to React that it happened to jQuery. It's ugly. It's cumbersome. There's too much of it. And thank you, Archon. ! merch. This is my shirt. See, it's got the Coding Garden logo on it. What do you call Vue if React is ugly? Come on, Terrawat. It's all opinions. Like, I feel like people that have been writing React for so long, at this point, they just have Stockholm Syndrome, right? Like, they also don't want to... It's hard to admit when you've been using a thing for so long, and also, like, you're an expert in that thing. It's hard to see the flaws, right? I think that's the scenario with React. Well, the thing is, people are tribal about everything, right? And I think especially because all these front-end frameworks, they have little logos. You can get behind a logo, and for a lot of people, it's their identity. I do not make a front-end framework my identity. I like Vue.js, but it is not who I am. Some people like React, and it is who they are. And that's just how people work. So, we have an answer to that, Oscar. It is solid. Solid is basically the good React. I guess like that. If Solid Start was in version 1.0 stable, I would have chosen that. I think that's the next thing to look out for aside from SvelteKit.